Welcome back to the deep dive. For a very long time, when we looked at global security, the map felt, well, manageable maybe. Borders, airspace, oceans. But the documents that guide modern strategy, especially something like Joint Publication 3.0, Joint Operations, they force us to look at a security environment that is infinitely more complex.
It truly is, yeah. Joint Publication 3.0 tells us the current global situation is defined by contested norms and persistent disorder. Threats aren't simple anymore. They're transregional. They span across all domains: land, sea, air, space, cyber, and they're multifunctional. So a challenge in one area, let's say cyberspace, immediately impacts military operations everywhere, often just disregarding geography and time.
Okay, let's try and unpack this blueprint then. Our mission today is a deep dive into the official doctrine, the thinking that dictates how the United States organizes, campaigns, and competes around the world. We're essentially aiming to give you, the listener, the cognitive framework used by the highest levels of military leadership. We'll be pulling specific, crucial insights from Joint Publication 3.0, Joint Doctrine Note 119, the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command Pamphlet 52592, and that analytical article, Sharpening Our Competitive Edge.
Yeah, think of this as maybe your shortcut through all that.
Yeah.
We're translating what can seem like a really complex volume of modern military thought into hopefully actionable knowledge. We're mapping out the specific strategic tools that Joint Force commanders use to navigate this continuous global competition. The goal is for you to walk away understanding this, well, monumental shift from focusing on just discrete wars to engaging in persistent integrated campaigning.
Okay, so we absolutely have to start with the core concept that frames all military action today, right? The competition continuum. As defined in Joint Publication 3.0, Chapter 5, this seems to be the strategic framework for pretty much everything the military does.
Absolutely, it's foundational. The continuum defines the relationship between actors as continuous. It rejects that old idea of a simple binary switch, peace or war. It acknowledges that nations are always engaged in interaction. Joint Publication 3.0 breaks this continuous spectrum down into three key segments: cooperation, competition, and then finally armed conflict or war.
And it feels like the vast majority of resources and time are spent in those first two segments, cooperation and competition. So what exactly are states competing for during this persistent phase?
Right. Joint Publication 3.0, Chapter 1 is really clear here. It states that states are continually competing for influence, leverage, and advantage. And it's crucial to break down what those mean. Influence is, well, the ability to cause a desired effect, directly or indirectly, in a relevant actor, another country, maybe a group. Advantage is defined as a superiority of position or condition. And that's often achieved through the careful exercise of all instruments of national power, diplomatic, informational, economic, not just military might.
And then there's leverage. How does that fit in?
Yeah, leverage is more the practical application. It's taking that strategic capital that gained advantage and using it to exploit a specific opportunity. And crucially, the doctrine notes that all these competitive assets, influence, leverage, advantage, they accrue primarily through the affiliation or alignment of relevant actors with the United States.
Huh. So success isn't just about what the U.S. military does alone.
Exactly. It's about building networks, maintaining relationships.
It almost sounds less like traditional military strategy and, I don't know, more like strategic portfolio management, where your partnerships yield compound interest over time.
Okay, this focus on alignment, it leads us to a concept that feels a bit counterintuitive: deterrence,
Yeah.
but in the context of cooperation.
Yes, this is one of the most critical conceptual shifts. You see it in Joint Doctrine Note 119 and Joint Publication 3.0. We typically think of deterrence as preventing an adversary from attacking us, right? But in the competition phase, deterrence also applies to cooperation because we have to ensure our partners are not deterred from working with us.
How could the United States inadvertently deter a partner? That seems odd.
Well, it can happen when our own actions, even if they're designed to deter an adversary, end up having negative political, diplomatic, or military consequences for our partner. So, for example, say we impose sanctions on an adversary. But what if that adversary is a really critical trade partner for one of our allies? That ally might then conclude that aligning too closely with the U.S. is just too politically or economically costly for them. Joint Doctrine Note 119 really emphasizes that if we fail to assure allies and partners that cooperation is beneficial, or at least not disruptive for them, securing future alignment becomes much harder. It's a very delicate balance. Our actions need to simultaneously deter the adversary and assure the partner.
That clarity is essential. Okay, so if the competition continuum is the strategic map, How does the Department of Defense manage the sheer operational headache of integrating priorities across that whole map? That sounds like where this concept of global integration comes in.
It's exactly right. Joint Publication 30, Chapter 4, describes global integration as the mechanism enabling Department of Defense leadership to function almost like a central nervous system for global operations. It maintains a global perspective, provides advice, helps make timely decisions, and informs operational priorities, even investment choices, across all the combatant commands and across different time horizons. Without it, you could easily see the commands acting more like competing regional entities rather than a cohesive whole.
And who is the chief operationalizer of this nervous system? Is it chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
That's right. The chairman's role, according to Joint Publication 30, both chapters 1 and 4, is pivotal here. They're responsible for operationalizing national strategies, aligning the actions of the joint force, balancing strategic risk, and, maybe most importantly, adjudicating competing priorities. I mean, given finite resources and near-infinite demands, the chairman has to advise the Secretary of Defense on how to balance regional needs against global threats. And this is done primarily through the development and execution of the Joint Strategic Campaign Plan.
Ah, the Joint Strategic Campaign Plan. That's the anchor, then, for all the operational planning. How does this sort of cascade down into the actual campaigns that guide the combatant commands?
Well, there's a pretty clear hierarchy of strategic plans. At the very top, you have the global campaign plans. These are designed to address the highest priority challenges, think competition with China or Russia, that really span across multiple combatant commands. Below that level, you find functional campaign plans. These address threats that aren't necessarily tied to one geographic area, but still require global coordination. Things like missile defense or countering violent extremist organizations.
And then finally, the more standard combatant command campaign plans, which are tailored for specific regions or areas of responsibility. Okay, so this entire structure, particularly the global campaign plans, it's organized around 5 mutually supporting mission areas.
That's right. These 5 mission areas, you'll find them in Joint Publication 30, Chapter 4, are the principal ways the Joint Force operates across that whole competition continuum. And they have to be executed simultaneously, not sequentially.
Okay, can you walk us through those 5 mission areas?
Sure. First, deter strategic attack. This is a constant, perpetual mission focused on those high-end threats like nuclear attacks, but also non-nuclear strategic strikes, including things in space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum. Second is deter conventional attack. Pretty straightforward. Third, assure allies and partners, absolutely critical for strengthening alignment, building capacity, and ensuring interoperability.
Okay, and the 4th mission area.
The fourth is compete below the level of armed conflict. This is that persistent day-to-day competition effort, all those activities designed to gain influence, leverage, and advantage without, triggering large-scale conflict. And finally, the 5th is prepare and respond to threats. This is the mechanism that ensures the joint force is postured and ready to actually execute operations if deterrence fails, while also campaigning for access and influence in contested regions even before a crisis.
All right, now that we've got the strategic framework laid out, let's move to maybe the mental discipline required to actually execute those campaigns. Operational art. Joint Publication 30 in the executive summary defines this as the commander's core cognitive approach.
Yes, operational art is that cognitive ability, that skill used by commanders and their staffs, and it relies heavily on their skill, knowledge, experience, creativity, and judgment to develop strategies and then execute campaigns and major operations. Its fundamental function is really to synthesize and integrate those critical elements of strategic planning: ends, ways, means, and, importantly, risks.
Okay, so if operational art is the philosophical approach, like the master painter guiding the campaign, then operational design is what? The analytical structure that makes the vision actually executable.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Operational design, again, according to Joint Publication 30, provides the analytical framework that underpins the whole planning process. It's described as an iterative process, helping planners organize their thoughts, understand the operational environment, and structure campaigns by defining those core questions. What are the ends? What are the ways? What means do we have? And what are the risks? It translates the commander's, let's say, artistic vision into concrete, actionable steps.
But wait, where does the creativity part come into play if commanders are following a defined analytical framework? Doesn't design risk reducing the art part to just a checklist?
Not really, no. The design framework doesn't dictate the answers. It structures the questions. The creativity in operational art comes from how the commander defines the problem in the first place, how they select the desired end state,
and then finds novel ways to use the existing means to achieve those ends, all while managing the associated risk. It's about recognizing patterns, seeing opportunities that maybe the analytical framework alone might not surface.
Joint Publication 3.0 uses a really powerful historical example to illustrate this operational art in practice, highlighting just how difficult command is at the operational level. The Solomons Campaign, August 1942 to February 1943.
Oh yeah, the Solomons Campaign is a classic textbook example of overcoming what we call operational friction. American commanders were fighting at the absolute limit of their supply lines, their operational reach. The challenge wasn't just defeating the enemy forces they encountered, but managing incredibly scarce resources, ships, planes, supplies. They had to constantly balance offensive action against the critical need for defense and sustainment. And they were making these vital decisions often based on incomplete, sometimes contradictory intelligence. Real fog of war stuff.
So this campaign wasn't won by a single decisive tactical victory, but rather by this relentless series of really tough operational decisions. The source even notes that costly naval battles, which might have seemed like tactical setbacks at the time, actually contributed to the larger campaign goal by attriting the Imperial Japanese Navy's readiness and eventually forcing them to withdraw.
It perfectly illustrates the concept of operational culmination. The U.S. commanders adapted, maybe just slightly faster than the enemy, preventing the Japanese from consolidating their position. They forced the Japanese operation to culminate, to reach its limit, and then recede. The success of that entire grueling operation hinged on those judgment calls made under intense fog and friction. That's a core element of operational art right there.
Okay, moving from the mindset of a single commander to the broader governmental effort, we need to talk about unified action and interorganizational cooperation. Campaigns are almost never won by military forces alone, are they?
No, absolutely not. Unified action, as defined in the Joint Publication 3.0 Executive Summary, is really the fundamental requirement for achieving unity of effort. It demands synchronization, coordination, and alignment of activities across a huge array of participants, not just military forces, but multinational partners, international organizations, NGOs, other governmental agencies, all hopefully working toward shared strategic objectives.
And this kind of whole-of-government approach seems critically dependent on the civil-military dialogue, especially early on in the planning.
It absolutely is. Joint Publication 3.0 stresses that senior military leaders have a unique responsibility here. They need to engage transparently and clearly with their civilian counterparts. Before any strategic objectives become too set in stone, too rigid, commanders must establish a shared understanding of the problem. They need to clearly articulate their assumptions, what their capabilities actually are, and what the costs and risks might be.
Why is that early clarity so vital?
Well, because civilian policymakers often, understandably, want to maintain maximum flexibility for as long as possible. But military planners, they need decisive direction relatively early to start organizing resources, planning logistics, moving forces. So the military has to clearly articulate what their capabilities can realistically achieve, what the inherent costs and risks are for each potential military option, and crucially, how those options contribute to solving the larger strategic problem. If that dialogue fails, you risk military action proceeding based on civilian assumptions that might be unachievable, or military plans that don't actually align with broader diplomatic or economic goals.
And this need for alignment obviously extends outward to our partners as well. Partner alignment. Joint Publication 3.0, Chapter 4 basically says the United States cannot achieve acceptable and sustainable strategic objectives in isolation.
That statement is pretty unambiguous, isn't it? Partners aren't just nice to have. The doctrine says they're vital. Collaboration increases military capacity, sure, but it also grants access to unique foreign capabilities, different legal authorities sometimes, enhances intelligence sharing, and significantly extends operational reach. When the problems themselves, like terrorism or regional aggression or pandemics, are just too complex for any one country to solve alone, successful partnering provides that comprehensive approach that global integration demands.
Right. Now, let's drill down a bit into the practical functions a Joint Force Commander has to organize and direct. These are the 7 joint functions, which seem to structure all operational activity.
That's correct. Joint Publication 3.0, Chapter 3, lists these 7 functions as the grouping of related capabilities and activities that enable commanders to synchronize, integrate, and direct joint operations across that entire competition continuum we talked about. They are command and control, information, intelligence, fires, movement and maneuver, protection, and sustainment.
Okay, of those 7, the The elevation of the information function really signals a fundamental change in how the military views warfare, doesn't it? What's its contemporary purpose?
Its elevation really signifies the recognition that the operational environment today is just saturated with information flow. It is an information environment. So the information joint function is defined as the deliberate integration of information-related capabilities with all the other functions, fires, maneuver, etc., to manage, maintain, or change the perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of relevant actors. And that includes supporting both human and automated decision-making. It's definitely no longer just a side task for public affairs officers. It's a core operational function intended to exert influence.
And this effort takes place within an incredibly complex, often chaotic information environment.
Indeed. Joint Publication 3.0, Chapter 3, notes that the Joint Force Commander is rarely the only voice out there, often not even the loudest. Individuals, non-governmental organizations, even non-state actors can wield, frankly, outsized influence because of the speed and reach of social media and traditional media.
Which necessitates immediate action, right? I mean, if a localized event gets broadcast instantly on a global social media platform, the commander needs to counter potential disinformation and manage the narrative basically in real time, not after some week-long bureaucratic review process.
Precisely. The doctrine says commanders must actively engage with social media services. They need to identify relevant non-military actors, local leaders, influencers, people who have inherent credibility, and leverage that. Furthermore, because adversaries are almost certainly going to try and discredit United States efforts, the military has to be prepared to quickly disseminate accurate, transparent information to counter propaganda. And this requires deep, real-time sociocultural analysis to understand the audience, to build and maintain legitimacy in the eyes of both the local populace and the wider global community.
Okay, let's shift focus now to how the military plans to actually fight against a peer competitor. This brings us squarely to joint all-domain operations. Appendix D in Joint Publication 3.0, the one on joint all-domain operations, highlights this continuously expanding operational environment.
Yeah, and that environment is expanding dramatically beyond just the traditional domains of air, land, and sea. It's characterized by rapid advancements in space, in cyberspace, and across the electromagnetic spectrum. These domains create transregional threats that just ignore physical and geopolitical boundaries. The consequence, as the doctrine bluntly notes, is that the United States' competitive military advantage has eroded, even while global demand for the joint force continues to exceed the available resources.
And this erosion makes the old legacy domain-centric approach basically obsolete, doesn't it? Why is joint all-domain operations the necessary imperative now?
Well, historically, joint doctrine often focused on deconflicting operations, sort of allowing the Army to focus on land, the Navy on sea, the Air Force in the air, often in segregated areas or times. Against a capable peer enemy, this kind of siloed approach is exactly what they would want us to do. Joint all-domain operations is necessary because it demands integrated action. It aims to generate shock and temporary advantages against enemy forces in their command systems by applying synchronized and simultaneous actions across space, cyberspace, and the physical domains.
But hang on, if we try to synchronize everything, space, cyber, physical domains, aren't we creating an incredibly complex command structure? One that a sophisticated near-peer could potentially disrupt just by targeting a few critical command and control nodes.
That's the central tension, absolutely. But the argument is that the risk of acting in separate silos is actually greater. Joint all-domain operations tries to account for that risk by demanding resilience, things like redundant systems, dispersed command, rapid reconstitution. The doctrine acknowledges that the enemy will disrupt our networks, yes, but the imperative remains. If we don't operate across all domains in an integrated way, the enemy will likely dominate one or more of them, making effective physical maneuver potentially impossible.
Okay. Appendix D details some specific objectives of joint all-domain operations. What are they trying to achieve globally with this approach?
Well, the objectives listed include things like gaining and maintaining access to the electromagnetic spectrum, degrading the enemy's anti-accessory denial systems, those systems designed to keep us attacking enemy operational level centers of gravity, and critically, maintaining our own freedom of action in all domains. It's really about leveraging the interconnectedness of these domains to apply the right capability at the right place and time, those decisive points, to generate the desired operational effects.
And this leads us to a fundamental shift in targeting, right? Moving beyond just physical objectives to targeting the invisible. As you said, you often can't see, touch, or feel many of the threats in this modern environment.
Yes, joint all-domain operations targeting is inherently complex because of that.
Commanders have to understand that even if threats are intangible, like denied communication or corrupted data, their effects can be profoundly dangerous. So targeting planners must synchronize resources, coordinate information requirements, and precisely time the execution of actions across the physical domains, the electromagnetic spectrum, and the information environment. All this has to enable successful schemes of maneuver, fires, and importantly, logistics.
Let's focus for a moment on the electromagnetic spectrum. Joint Publication 3-S, Chapter 4, actually calls it a maneuver space, just like land or sea.
It absolutely is treated as a maneuver space now. The electromagnetic spectrum environment is heavily contested, primarily because of the rapid proliferation of technologies. Think advanced radios, sensors, jammers, and the relatively low cost for adversaries to acquire and utilize pretty sophisticated jamming and sensing capabilities. Given how heavily digitized United States forces rely on the electromagnetic spectrum for almost everything, communication, navigation, targeting, remote operations achieving at least parity, if not superiority, in this domain is essential to all joint operations. So joint electromagnetic spectrum operations, or GEMSO, have to be integrated throughout any campaign plan to secure that maneuver space. If we lose control of the electromagnetic spectrum, our highly interconnected forces risk losing cohesion and effectiveness very quickly.
And finally, cyberspace operations. These also have to be thoroughly integrated into planning from the start.
Absolutely critical. Joint Publication 3-0, Chapter 3, mandates that commanders must plan how to identify and secure key terrain in cyberspace, integrate their own cyberspace capabilities, and actively counter the enemy's use of that domain. This really involves two distinct, though related forms of operation. First, you have offensive cyberspace operations. These leverage an adversary's reliance on information technology and data to project power, often involving cyberspace attack actions designed to disrupt, degrade, or even destroy enemy systems or data.
And the defensive side.
That's defensive cyberspace operations. These focus on preserving friendly cyberspace capabilities, protecting our own data, networks, and systems. And this is a constant proactive effort, hunting for threats, monitoring networks, analyzing traffic, detecting intrusions, and responding to ongoing malicious activity. The goal here is to maintain freedom of maneuver in cyberspace for the joint force while denying that same critical freedom to the enemy.
All right, all of this complex doctrine is being shaped by a pretty stark reality, which is described in the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command pamphlet 52F592. This document looks specifically at the operational environment for the next decade or so, and it provides some really critical context for thinking about large-scale combat operations, or LSCO.
Yeah, the foreword to that pamphlet sets a rather sobering stage. It says that after 2 decades where the focus was largely on violent extremist organizations, our traditional, well-resourced adversaries, specifically China and Russia, have reasserted themselves. And the document states, quite directly, that they studied us as the United States executed operations over those 20 years, and they are now actively incorporating those lessons into their own defense planning and modernization. We simply can't assume decisive overmatch right from the start anymore.
Let's detail the profile of the pacing threat, as they call it, China.
Right. China is designated as the pacing threat. They're focusing their modernization efforts on being able to defeat the United States regionally, and perhaps eventually globally, in a joint multi-domain war. Their approach is defined by this term intelligentized warfare. Essentially, it's a strategy focused on integrating artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies right across the board. The goal is to dramatically increase their information processing speed, accelerate their decision-making cycles, facilitate the use of things like swarms of uncrewed systems, and ultimately dominate the information and cognitive domains. It's a whole-of-nation effort to try and beat the U.S. not just technologically, but in the speed and quality of decision-making itself.
And what about the acute threat, Russia? How is their approach characterized?
Russia, termed the acute threat, seems to maintain its focus on conducting prolonged, attritional, large-scale combat operations using a fire-centric massed force approach. The United States Army Training and Doctrine Command pamphlet 52592 notes that Russia continues to favor massed artillery and rocket fires, sometimes against targets they can't even precisely locate, rather than relying solely on precision strikes against identified targets. They also place a really profound emphasis on information warfare, operating under the belief that Western democracies are particularly vulnerable, ill-suited perhaps, to effectively counter persistent state-sponsored information manipulation campaigns.
Okay, and this new or re-emerging battlefield is also characterized by a factor that seems to fundamentally change warfighting: battlefield transparency.
Yeah, that transparency is increasing incredibly rapidly, mainly due to the democratization of technology.
Things like commercial satellite imagery, the proliferation of autonomous systems, drones, etc., and real-time data fusion capabilities are really eroding that traditional fog and friction of war that commanders historically dealt with, maybe even relied on sometimes. The pamphlet explicitly warns that adversaries who previously had quite limited intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities will now be able to utilize publicly available data, open-source artificial intelligence tools, and machine learning to achieve something close to relative parity in targeting capabilities with the United States.
And a key driver of both this transparency and the increased lethality is the proliferation of uncrewed systems.
The transformation there is just undeniable, isn't it? We see it in the news constantly. Uncrewed aerial systems, especially those relatively cheap first-person view or one-way attack systems, loitering munitions, are rapidly transforming both target acquisition and weapons delivery. The TREDOC pamphlet highlights that the low acquisition cost and wide availability of these systems allow even smaller state and non-state actors to effectively build what amount to facsimile air forces. Furthermore, the persistent, pervasive threat posed by these systems, operating often at very low cost, has a potent, sustained cognitive effect on ground forces. Constant worry, constant vigilance required.
And all of this is happening within a highly contested environment, particularly centered on the challenge of anti-accessoria denial systems, or A2AD.
Right. Anti-accessoria denial efforts by adversaries are generally structured around three primary goals. First, denying the deployment of U.S. forces into the theater in the first place. Second, denying freedom of action once our forces are deployed. And third, causing significant desynchronization of the joint force, disrupting our command and control and logistics. This is exactly why Joint Publication 3.0 emphasizes the criticality of littoral operations in coastal areas. It notes that these areas offer essential positions from which to begin, sustain, and support joint operations, and potentially gain leverage over the enemy through operational maneuver from the sea.
And the doctrine explicitly recognizes that access and sustainment, basically logistics, will be under constant attack right from the homeland all the way to the forward edge of the battlefield.
That's the harsh reality of potential large-scale combat operations. The battlefield is defined by contested logistics. As we've seen starkly in recent conflicts around the world, logistics nodes, main supply routes, ports, airfields, even repair facilities are going to be priority targets. The ability to rapidly repair, regenerate, or simply replace large amounts of damaged or destroyed material while actively engaged in combat will be absolutely critical to sustaining, let alone winning, any kind of protracted fight against a peer competitor.
Okay, so given these pretty stark realities, there obviously has to be an institutional response to guide the necessary adaptation and modernization. This brings us to the joint warfighting concept.
Exactly. The joint warfighting concept, as discussed in that article, Sharpening Our Competitive Edge, is described as the North Star, guiding the entire Department of Defense's institutional adaptation. It's essentially the analytical playbook for how the U.S. intends to gain and maintain positions of advantage against these advanced adversaries. Its core purpose is to force the joint force to fundamentally rethink competition, deterrence, and conflict itself. And this necessitates a significant shift in how we utilize current capabilities and, crucially, what new capabilities we need to develop and field.
And the key body responsible for translating this high-level intellectual concept into tangible requirements seems to be the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, or JROC.
Yes. The Joint Requirements Oversight Council is pivotal in this whole transformation process. It's convened by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and this council brings all the military services together. Their job is to rigorously assess the specific capabilities demanded by the joint warfighting concept. They identify gaps between what's needed and what we have, and then they make joint recommendations for filling those gaps across all the elements of force readiness. That's doctrine, organizations, training, material, leadership development, policy, facilities, and personnel. This DOTM-LPFP framework ensures that modernization isn't just driven by individual service wish lists, but by the coherence required for truly joint warfighting.
Let's use that contested logistics challenge we just discussed as a tangible example. How does the Joint Requirements Oversight Council use these detailed capability reviews to tackle something like that?
That's a perfect illustration, actually, drawn from Sharpening Our Competitive Edge. The Joint Requirements Oversight Council tackles these major cross-functional problems, like contested logistics, through what they call capability portfolio management reviews. For contested logistics, these reviews did things like characterize both existing military and commercial capabilities that could be leveraged. They worked to balance long-term sustainment costs against immediate operational needs.
and they graded the progress of critical procurement programs relevant to logistics. Most importantly, perhaps, they highlighted the feasible air and maritime logistics technologies, things like autonomous resupply platforms, advanced additive manufacturing, or 3D printing capabilities closer to the front lines that are necessary to successfully implement the joint warfighting concept in what will inevitably be a disaggregated and very expansive logistics environment.
So it sounds like this whole process is designed to ensure that the doctrine, the equipment, the training, the personnel policies, the strategy, everything is moving in lockstep toward a unified goal. It's about providing that coherence needed to operate effectively across all domains and regions.
Exactly. That coherence involving not just the military services, but also, critically, our allies, our partners, and the defense industrial base is viewed as generating an almost exponential advantage, particularly in that persistent competition phase where advantages are often subtle, cumulative, and built over time. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, this has been an incredibly detailed deep dive into the blueprint of modern U.S. military strategy. I think the core takeaway, which hopefully you, the listener, can now articulate clearly, is this monumental shift. It's a shift away from thinking about traditional sequential warfare towards an integrated continual campaign approach, one that has to simultaneously manage cooperation, competition, and the ever-present threat of armed conflict across all domains, physical, informational, and cognitive.
It really does require an enduring, long-term commitment that fundamentally alters how we even conceptualize national security. And maybe to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on, Joint Publication 30, Chapter 6, makes a really crucial observation about the aftermath of conflict. It states that the joint force should campaign in armed conflict always with a long-term view toward the transition period following the cessation of the main fighting, because wars rarely just cease with an immediate and complete end to all armed conflict.
That raises a profound question for national policy, doesn't it? What does it really mean when the military views victory not as some kind of neat, illusory stopping point, but merely as a transition point in an ongoing campaign? A point that requires the effort to continue, possibly for years or even decades afterward, mixing cooperation, maybe low-level competition, perhaps even simmering conflict.
It means, I think, that the long-term consequences of even the most successful examples of joint warfighting are seen as inseparable from the conflict itself. It really compels us, as a nation, to consider the enduring commitment required to consolidate any gains effectively. Because a failure in that final, sustained campaigning phase could easily reduce future options for policymakers and lead to, well, inconclusive long-term strategic results, regardless of battlefield success. As the doctrine implies, the joint force views success as a long series of informed and deliberate transitions, not just one decisive moment.
A lot to think about there regarding the long game indeed. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
It was my pleasure.